in the economy. Right now, people have to get a job to make money to pay their lives. Okay. But along comes synthetic biology, 3D printing, AI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not necessarily a clear long term future for having a job to make a living. So we may have to, at some point, tax these robots, tax these AIs. There's all this new wealth creating up. Well, where's it going? To just an elite 0.01%? That's not a stable future, friends. They know that too up there. So we've got to figure out how to get the investment cycle all the way through the whole system and create some sort of a baseline income so that you're not thrown in the street.
Co-founder and director of the Millennium Project, which is a global participatory think tank that we will find out more about on this episode where we discuss futurology and the future of humanity. Thanks, Jerome Glenn, for joining us here.
My pleasure.
So I have to say that I actually have myself. So Jerome has developed the Futures Wheel, which is a tool that futurists, strategic foresight practitioners, and so on use. I have to say I have used this tool many times myself in various contexts with startup founders, enterprise people, students, you name it. And it's been actually one of my favorite tools in the arsenal, in the repertoire, so to say. So yeah, so that's very from that perspective too. A pleasure to have you here. But before we go into discussing some of the topics, the big topics that I hope to learn more about with you and have a conversation on, let's perhaps could we speak about your own personal relation to the field of futurology, maybe some of the biographic factors that led you into the field, and also how you see the field evolving and how it has evolved over the decades that you have been in the field. When you look back, maybe those two things are a bit connected. Can you tell us a bit about that kind of background and the evolution of yourself as a futurologist and of the field of futurology?
Yeah, I used to joke that it was some sort of a cosmic particle that caused a glitch in my brain, and it's been ruining my view ever since. Several things. One, as I look back in my college time and Peace Corps time and early career time, I seemed that I was always looking at future stuff. I was lazy. I like to view science fiction movies rather than be the books, but I do read some. I did Brave New World in 1984 back to back. But I didn't really sort of get serious about this stuff until I was asked when I was working on my master's degree to join a little group to help invent this future of education for the state of Vermont. And in the invitation, it said, we're going to meet at this great ski lodge for 3 days. Well, as your typical poor graduate student, the answer was yes, not realizing that it was a commitment for 3/4 of a year, every 2 weeks, but another nice ski lodge. So everything was great. And I got a box in the mail of Xeroxes written by people, Alvin Toffler, Herman Kahn, Bucky Fuller, people I'd never heard about. And 3 hours later, I got up from the chair and said, damn, this is the most interesting stuff I'd ever read in my life.
Sure, I can imagine that. You had Alvin Toffler there and Buckminster Fuller.
Everything all together, just tons of stuff. One Xerox after another. I was just going like this for 3 hours. And so early on, the group, it was like one teacher, I was one graduate student, one state board member, one this, one that sort of deal. And so in the early part, we were taught futures research methodology. The futures wheel didn't exist at that point. And it dawned on me that what these methods were about was condensing a lot of information for a better decision or for understanding a framework in which to make a better decision. And I went, well, God, the teaching should be something about this. So I started converting futures methods into teaching techniques. For example, there's a method called cross-impact analysis. How does this potential future event affect this event? So you like make a list of things down one side, repeat them again all on the top, then you got a little grid. So you say, how does number one affect number two? And now one affect number three. And so, which is a good way to organize a lot of complex stuff to see, because for better or worse, the future is an interaction of a lot of these things. So this helps you sort through that. Well, it dawned on me, what happens if you're a biology teacher and you wanted to teach the interdependency of the human body? Well, you put a circulatory system, respiratory system, endocrine system, except down the side, same ones towards the top. If this system works right, how does it affect this one? If it malfunctions, so in one sheet, you got the interdependency of the human body. Well, that got me running around the United States talking about futuristic curriculum development. How do you take what you're teaching is sort of like future oriented a bit. And then I got then I was offered to do a doctor's degree in future studies. So I was part of the first group of 5 at the University of Massachusetts School of Education, which was the first doctor's program, as far as we know, in the world. But I ended up breaking up with my girlfriend, so I left town. But I got a nice job down in Washington, D.C. for the Committee for the Future, which was the beginning of participatory future stuff. People assume that the public has something to say about the future. Well, I got news. Back in the 60s, they didn't. You got to pay taxes. And the think tank, the RAND Corporation, and so they're the ones supposed to figure this out. And you didn't go visit the RAND Corporation. You didn't visit the Hudson Institute. I mean, these were places you heard about at a distance. Public, beware. Don't walk through these doors. Well, the Committee for the Future, started by a woman named Barbara Hubbard, we used to do these participatory processes where people would think together with hot shots and regular people together. And so one thing led after the next from that until I was asked to organize the Millennium Project by an organization called the Futures Group, which is one of the first Futures was the first think tank for profit. All the rest of them were nonprofit ones. And they said that there ought to be a mega study for the year 2000. This was 1988. And it ought to be done with the United Nations University, because I was working for the UN University at that time. Which, for your listeners, probably don't know that, but you don't hear about UN University because it doesn't have a basketball team, But it's headquartered in Tokyo. It's the only global part of the UN headquartered in all of Asia, and it's to sew together universities for global research. So anyway, I was a liaison between Tokyo and Washington. So the idea would be, well, the UN University would be the great umbrella to do this mega study for the year 2000, because if a for-profit think tank did it, people would say, well, I don't know. It came out of the United States. We can't trust that. So I didn't want to do a mega study, because there's tons of mega studies. And, what's the impact of all these mega studies? I said, what we need is a mega system to create mega studies like that, cranking them out. Sort of like, the inventor's lab relative to global futures. And that's what the Millennium Project became, for better or for worse. And we have the pleasure of having these nodes. These are groups of individuals and institutions around the world that pick the best brains they can get their hands on, and we all pull it together. So we're doing a participatory, sort of like expert sourcing stuff, and then feed it back to the different nodes and so forth. And then the nodes are as diverse as is Iran and Israel, Azerbaijan and Armenia. So we're not doing the work on behalf of a country or ideology or an issue, but like, how does the whole game, how are we, the human species, doing? I don't care if you're in North Korea or you're in Lower Slovenia. You're a human being. We're in this game together. How do we look at this game together? That's the idea.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And actually, I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into that as well, about the emergence of a global brain or some kind of collective consciousness, which are, I think, very important challenges for humanity in our time. But before we get there, just still on the field of the evolution of the field of futurology.
Yeah.
So I mean, in have you have certainly also witnessed the proliferation of the term futurist, and
Yeah. Oh, I know.
nowadays it's like
It's now,
everybody's a futurist.
I know,
So,
it's chic. Before it was like,
yeah,
what terminal disease do you have, buddy? But now it's like it's cool to be a futurist.
yeah. And but is it? Yeah, I mean, it's probably one of the terms like that, like entrepreneur, which is like
Right,
everybody's
right,
calling
right,
themselves a
right,
futurist nowadays.
right,
If you look at people's bios and so on, but
right.
is the fact that it's so ubiquitous, is that a good thing or a bad thing from the perspective of maybe like having that field as a rigorous field, or as a field that has some contribution to make, that people will take more seriously? What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot
Yeah.
about that. And that's sort of like arbitrarily begin, and you can interrupt me and change and question along the way. As I mentioned, the early days of futures research essentially came out of the Rand Corporation, and the job was to prevent World War III. Everything else was sort of entertainment. When they made comments about the economy or other computers and so forth, that was sort of side fun. But the real stuff was to prevent World War III. And I'll take one strain of that to give you an idea of evolution. Scenarios were invented by a guy named Herman Kahn at the Rand Corporation. And the reason he invented scenarios was not to be this 2x2 little matrix you may have seen. Some of you have seen scenario planning. They'll say,
Mhm.
what are the two biggest uncertainties? So imagine that uncertainty one goes this way and that way. And imagine uncertainty two goes this way and that way. So you got like a little X, so you got four little squares. You say, now in each of these squares, how does it, what strategies will work the best for you? That was not the idea. But that is what it has evolved into. You go running around the world. I don't care if you're in Japan, where you are. We do scenario planning. Well, they forget the main part. The main idea was to figure out what you didn't know,
Mhm.
that you didn't know you didn't know it, and you didn't even know that was a question that was important for the future you're talking about. Why?
Right.
Because with the 2x2 matrix, people are describing endpoints. Perfectly good thing to do.
Mm.
But the point is, how did you get to that endpoint? What are the if-then plausible connections and decisions? Because any writer will tell you that as they write a fiction piece, you get to a point you say, I have no idea what happens next. I never thought about that.
Mhm.
So this is the idea, is that all the military historians in the world were not completely relevant to preventing thermonuclear war. Why? Because Germany and Japan is still there after World War II. Whereas World War III, as was conceived,
Mhm.
we wouldn't be here. So the risk was like total. If there's a 0.0001 chance, you don't want to do it because that finishes the game. So the whole reasoning process was different. So they had
Mhm.
to think differently. So how are you going to think differently? That was the idea of telling the stories. Well, we'll tell still stories going out in different directions, and we'll learn what we don't know. And I'll let you in on a big secret. One of the ideas was, what happens if there's no thermonuclear war in 30 years? They're doing this work back in the 50s and 60s,
Mhm.
which turned out to be the case. Um, and you end up in a situation where you're going to actually have one. What do you do to prevent this? And it dawned on them that in 30 years, you won't know the technologies necessarily. You won't know the geopolitics
Mhm.
necessarily, and you don't know who's in the Kremlin, or even if it is the Kremlin, it might be China, might be somebody else.
Mhm.
There's too much unknown. You don't know. But you had to convince whomever that was 30 years from now that you were crazy enough to press the button. Because if you were not crazy enough to press the button, then those little ships can go right into Cuba, no problem. Right?
Right.
So how would you convince somebody that you're nuts? They didn't know. So in other words, again, the scenario had to make sense as you're writing the story.
Mhm.
And you can say, oh, there's, how do you convince the unknown you're crazy? I mean, they didn't know. They had to stop writing and think. And
Interesting.
and the answer was traffic jams.
Mhm.
Imagine that you're in Moscow or somewhere, and there's this threat of nuclear war, and all of a sudden you're seeing news reports from the United States with traffic jams going from Miami out to fallout shelters, New York going out to fallout shelters, Chicago,
Mhm.
all over the
Mhm.
United States. They're all going out to these fallout shelters. What do you think? The Americans are crazy. They're actually going to go to war.
Okay, so that's misinformation or
Correct.
like
Yeah,
information warfare.
yeah, you could say that.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's an early form of it. Yeah. And
Mhm.
now, which means that you had to have real fallout shelters, you had to have
Mhm.
real training programs, you had to do it all for real. But you couldn't say that during the Cold War because if you did, it would blow the whole idea, right? But
Right.
there's an example of where a scenario was used to find out what we didn't know and how we acted on what we didn't know.
Hmm.
So when you talk about the evolution of the field, scenarios is one of those popular techniques. Futures wheel's not doing too bad, but that's mostly among practitioners of future stuff that use that one.
Mhm.
But the scenarios, by not doing the if-then connections, you miss what you didn't know.
Mhm.
So you can
Mhm.
do your 2 by 2 grid and all that. That's perfectly fine. But then have people say, here we are today. What happens next? What happens next? What happens next? What happened next?
Right.
Because maybe that future is not plausible.
Yeah, I mean, in recent times, there's been, we had first we had, I mean, maybe that was due to, I think, Donald Rumsfeld, who introduced the unknown unknowns
I
into
know
popular
we knew
parlance and
Herman
so on.
Kahn.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
but no, but what I
amazing.
was going
He
to
screwed
refer
up.
to
He,
is the from a real kind of theoretical perspective, I think the work of Nassim Taleb has been quite important around the black swans and
yeah, yeah,
these kind of events that
yeah,
that
yeah,
are these very, very unlikely and unpredictable events, but when
yep,
they occur, they
yep,
really kind of change the game
yep,
completely.
yep.
And by their very nature, you cannot predict them. So the point is to
Oh,
not
wait,
predict them, but rather to
we can take a
prepare
pause.
for the
We can
rather
talk.
prepare
Hey,
for the
we can talk.
eventuality.
Yeah, we can
Mhm.
talk about that a little bit. There's a
Mhm.
database that my partner in crime, that Ted Gordon, who invented cross impact analysis with another guy, I was part of the Rand Corporation's early days.
Mhm.
He's now created a database, an if-then database, of I think like I don't know, thousands of these black swans. When you say you can't predict them, well, sit down and keep going, and maybe you can get there. So the idea would be, as you're writing your scenario, you do
Mhm.
this if-then database, and you randomly get these things hitting you. It says, well, what would you do about this? What would you? So yeah, we actually have created a method out of that for testing plausibility and robustness
Right.
of scenarios with these quote surprises.
Like
And
speculative,
yeah, yeah,
it's the
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
you come up
yeah,
with
yeah, and
whatever that could happen, and then you
yeah,
look at how could this really change and impact our assumptions that we have here in our grid.
correct.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. So just to so the in your view, the evolution of the field of futurology, just to bring that back to the
yeah,
question
yeah.
of
Right.
that we have this
Well, that was one
proliferation
strain
now.
that I did. That one strain.
Yeah.
So the idea is that you had sort of serious rigor when it started, and then it got popularized and became superficial. Now, that's sort of normal when you think about it. Think of the early days of education, for example, in the United States. The elites. That's why we call it the Ivy League college, Harvard. All that. Like you have Oxford in the UK and all that. The elites went there.
Mhm.
You know, but then we started to have universities and public school systems expand out, and education became more superficial, not as rigorous, and so forth. But then eventually, with our artificial intelligence and podcasts and all this sort of stuff that you're involved in, is slowly coming back, and it will make us more intelligent and richer. But we're in this sort of in between stage in
Mhm.
future
Mhm.
stuff where it does become popularized, does become more superficial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it will, with AI and other sort of advances, it will get a little bit better again. We just have to go through
Mhm.
this period.
Sure.
Now, I'm not too upset about this because at least it gets people to say, what might happen next?
Right.
I mean, because the first view was there's nothing new under the sun.
Mm.
This is just a repackaging different things. No, 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 no. It really is different. And so people are beginning to come to grips with not only is it different, but it's up for grabs.
Mm.
We can now invent the damn game. There are so many possibilities that are really possible that the question comes up, well, what do we want to do? It wasn't a question in the past. It was like, how do I fit in?
Mm.
You would predict the future to fit in,
Mhm.
right? Now it's like, well, do we want to do this? Do we want to do that? Well, let's talk about it. That's
Yeah.
the beginning of a mature species, in my judgment.
Sure. The futurist is not there to is not a soothsayer who's just there to predict things, but is more like actively participating in the informed construction of the future, right?
Yeah,
Like by
right,
helping us choose the right possibilities, avoid dangers, and so on,
right. Yeah.
right?
No, we predict, but not in the sense in which most people mean it. We would
Right.
predict to say, this will happen if you don't
If
do anything.
yeah, if we don't do anything
If you
about
do
this,
this,
if this,
then this
right?
will happen. So we're not predicting, we take bets like anybody else.
It's more of a probabilistic
Correct.
game maybe,
That's right.
but yeah, that's so that's 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 really interesting to to have your perspective on the evolution of the field. Now
Mhm.
to to come back to the the the
Yeah,
global participatory think tank, I think
yeah.
it's obviously, I mean, for us, and you alluded to this right now as well, a major task for our times is to connect the planet. We already have obviously the internet connecting us on a information theoretical kind of plane, with regards to the exchange of data and information, and businesses being able to communicate and work together and so on, and individuals being able to access knowledge and each other's expertise and so on. But I mean, there's still so much to be done to
Mhm.
actually create a connected humanity in the sense of having a global consciousness, having a global shared understanding, a shared kind of mission, a shared way of tackling the big problems that we're facing as humanity, which are all planetary problems. They're not anymore like
Mhm.
single nation problems, right? So there's still so much to be done in with regards to that. So in how much, and projects like the Millennium Project could very well be sources of inspiration or sources
Mhm.
of insight for this larger task for
Yeah.
humanity. So where do you see, what were the experiences gained of this experiment? Could you tell us more about how does it work? So you said there's nodes, and the nodes kind of contribute together. It's already sounds sort of like a global brain. Could you tell us more about the operation of the Millennium Project and the insights and experiences and the lessons that were gained from this? Maybe also for the general idea of creating a collective intelligence.
Mhm. Well, it's nice to see there's been a variety of people attempting to copy us. So I guess I guess it's okay. And it turns out it's a little harder than people thought. We were very lucky. I mean, really lucky, um, because by coming out of the United Nations University, it took care of a lot of political problems that would normally be the case in doing this. If we had started this as a Washington thing, we would not have Iran, maybe not China, not the involvement of China like that we have. But China's published every single publication, State of the Future, we've done. Same with Iran, but it starts in the name of God, the State of the Future. But by being born out of the UN University, it took care of a lot of right wing, left wing politics. Because in the early days of the United Nations University, it's a little more left than it was right.
Mhm.
And so as a result, the both sides could sort of like collaborate. If we had been born almost any other way, I don't know if we would have been as successful. Secondly, our timing was just lucky as well, because although the internet protocol was back in the late 60s, 70s, it didn't sort of catch on until the 90s. Well, that's when we began. So as a result, we hit that wave and surfed it all the way around the world. So that was a lucky one too. Um, the first we did a 3-year, we did a pre-feasibility study because the UN University says, surely somebody's wants to create a global think tank, for God's sake. That's not a particularly original idea. Well, yeah, but what people meant by their view of a think tank was like Harvard would have a person from China who got their master's degree and their doctor's degree at Stanford, and somebody from India who got theirs off at Cornell or whatever, and they call it a global think tank, right? Anyway, but the nice thing about the UN university model, it was a distributed system. It sews together universities around. So we had that footsteps to follow, in a sense, so you create a global system by leaving people where they are. You don't put them all in the Brookings Institution building. So we found out that after a year's pre-feasibility study, checking out, are there anybody working on this? And the answer was really no. And then one of the people at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, whose job it was to do the future stuff for the EPA, said, we need you to be successful because we want to have an interlocutory. We'll do the United States, but we need some global system to interact with. And there isn't anything really. UN Environment Program, but that's a bunch of nation states. It's not quite the same deal. So then that led us into a 3-year feasibility study. I know this is hard to believe, but we did a 1-year pre, then a 3-year feasibility study. During the 3-year feasibility study, like, how would you do this after all? One of the ideas, it was a guy in Moscow who said, hey, if you do this for real, I want to be your guy in Moscow. Then somebody else said the same, well, I want to be your person in Egypt. So they started popping up around the world saying, hey, we want to play in this game some way. So the idea of a node evolved to what we mean by it today. The ideal firm, nothing is ever perfect, right? But the ideal version would be like 1 or 2 institutions or individuals from government, 1 or 2 from business, 1 or 2 from universities, 1 or 2 from NGOs, and 1 or 2 from whatever international organization, whether it's NATO or whether it's UNESCO or whatever it is in that country. So that when we send out a question to these nodes around the world, the business people would say, who knows the most about this question in business? And they're calling up Frank. It's a personal, deal. Same with the universities and government. So you have a global system on a first name basis.
Right. It's very important, I think, to have that kind of multi-stakeholder approach, to not be one-sided in the perspectives. And then then could you tell us more about how does the process work?
Well, okay. So we have a planning committee meeting during COVID in cyberspace, but not non-COVID. We all get together somewhere. And before we get together, we have a little questionnaire saying, what do you want to do? Where's the gap in what we've done? We've done this, we've done this. We do the State of the Future report that's supposed to, overview the whole situation. Or what gaps did you see in there? And then you say, okay, those are the 10 things that are the gaps. So we would do the questionnaire and saying, okay, which of these 10 things is the most important? Where can we have an impact? What's useful? What's the budget? Who's going to do it? Who's going to, and so we get all that done as much as possible before we actually have the meeting so we can get down to business. So it's a participatory process to set our agenda. Now, people do knock on our door and say, hey, can you do a global assessment on future developments like Ernst & Young last year? Well, we have to do that sort of thing for our State of the Future anyway. So we're happy to have them pay for our research. Another one was out of Kuwait. They wanted to have a collective intelligence. We did an early collective intelligence system for Kuwait's oil company. Normally, that would be a consulting type of contract. But we did it because then we learned how to write the software for it, how to do it, what's the procedures, and so forth. Well, then we share that with all the nodes around the world.
So it's mostly private sector clients that utilize it?
No, it's a complete mix. As a matter of fact, if you want to have, if your listeners want to check this out, they just go to Millennium with 2 L's and 2 N's, not the French way. This is the British way. 2 L's and 2 N's, hyphen, not underline, hyphen, project.org. You will see under there about the sponsors. And we've had sponsors from UNESCO to the U.S. Army. And that's about as different as I can get on the planet. So we have, so there's private sector companies, sponsors. Deloitte & Touche was for 10 years as sponsors. We have governments sometimes as well, but it's a mix. We've even had universities once in a while, which is unusual. Because universities, they shake hands with their hand out, you know.
Sure. So yeah, I know a little bit about that, but yeah, so the with regards to the again, about the connectivity that you've created there amongst really people from different countries, from different backgrounds, different
Right,
stakeholders from different perspectives,
right,
different vested interest, and so on.
right.
What's the insight there, that could be generalized maybe
Good.
about the creation of a global consensus or a global consciousness? Are there any insights there that we could
Yeah.
glean from that?
Well, we're a long way from what you're talking about, but we're farther down the road than I know of anybody else. You can say, well, wait a minute, Wikipedia. I say, well, yes, Wikipedia is information and knowledge and data, but not coherence. That's a different game. It doesn't
Mm.
put it together. And the same way with Google searches. I had a pleasure of giving a talk at their headquarters and saying this is the greatest enterprise in history. And it got rid of the phrase "I don't know." Just means I didn't Google it yet, right?
Mhm.
So the coherence is a big deal. And also, the nice thing about our approach is moving it along is when we talk about a global understanding or a global consciousness or that sort of evolution stuff, it doesn't mean that everybody walks in the same way. Think of a multifaceted future. You don't ask a trumpet to be a violin. That's stupid. But you have an orchestra, you have an opera, you know, you have sheet music, you have audience feedback. Change it this way. So we
I
use
thought you were referring to a Trump supporter there with trumpet, but then I got no, it was an instrument. Okay.
well, we do. As a matter of fact, we have
Okay.
some Trump. Yeah, we do. We do. We do. We do. But the metaphor of an opera
Yeah.
uh, is not only good for the way I just said it, because you're not asking people to be different than they are, but how can we
Mhm.
fit together? So when we fit together, it's different than saying we all think the same way,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
we're not trying to get everybody to think the same way, because that's what you call a dictatorship, right?
Right. Right.
Um,
It's
but
not about it's not about generating that kind of uniform
correct,
or bringing everything down to the common denominator and just
right?
having that uniform view, but it's rather about creating like a polyphony of different
That's
voices
right.
that we can still have in one narrative, right? Or that we can
That's
still
right.
have as part of one meta narrative or some kind of
Yeah,
larger,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, I mean, in the United States, we had this view called manifest destiny. Now, it didn't include the Africans and it didn't include the original Asians, but for the rest of the folks, it was a multifaceted view. Go west and make wealth. How? Well, that was your decision.
Okay.
Now, a lot of the stuff is shaping up. There's reason to be optimistic here. We can get to some pessimism later on, but
Hmm.
optimism at the moment is you've got this thing called the International Organization of Standards.
Okay.
You've heard people say, well, this is ISO 9000 compliant, or this is ISO this compliant.
Hmm.
And the international IEEE that puts together standards on a bunch of stuff. Now, these are standards that are becoming the norm standards of civilization slowly, and it's a participatory process. Anybody can go to the website of International Organization Standards and sort of see how the process works. So if you think there ought to be a standard on how you pick your nose, okay, fine. You start the process, and if people buy in, you eventually create a standard. And then you
Yeah.
can say, then you publish the standard and say, okay, I am ISO compliant on picking my nose. That's why you should do business with me rather than the other guy. And this is a participatory process, in a sense, under the radar, because you don't hear much politics about it.
No, no, sure, yeah.
Right?
Obviously, very, very important with regards to the establishment of standards for
Yes,
artificial intelligence,
yes.
for
I'm on
technology,
their committee, as
automatic,
a matter of fact.
right?
Yeah.
For the
Yeah. I'm
IEEE
on the
IEEE committee.
IEEE governance, IA. Yeah, and they're doing narrow intelligence, not general intelligence. We can talk about those
Sure. Yeah.
distinctions later on.
No, yeah, I've been privy to some of those conversations. That, not directly part of it, but
Yeah.
so I know of the work that's going on there. But I think when we're talking about this right now, I think it's important at this point, obviously, to point to what's happening in the world right now, where there is a real trend, or not, there's a real kind of, not just a trend, but a reality of the world potentially moving into opposing blocks again, and into a multipolar or
Yeah.
bipolar kind of situation, and a Cold War kind of
Yeah.
situation again, which is obviously not conducive at all to the generation of a global integrated consciousness, and also not conducive to us tackling all the big problems that we need to tackle as humanity. I
Right.
mean, we have all of these major things coming up: bioethics, of genetic engineering, climate, how we handle AI, and autonomous, and so on and so forth, and all of these things we have to, space exploration, all of these things we have to tackle as a collective, as an integrated humanity. So our best situation would be to have like a federation of the planet, or something like that, like in Star Trek, where the planet is united, right? But the world is not going in that direction, like, at all right now. We're kind of moving into a
Well,
bipolar confrontation
yeah.
again, a new Cold War
Yeah.
situation potentially.
So
Like,
some things may be a blip in the map, and some things may be long-term trends. And that's one of the things that futures are supposed to be halfway decent at. The stuff with Putin may be a blip in the thing. Now, I grant you that Russia has never really had the culture of democracy. But neither has a whole lot of other countries, by the way. We're talking about the culture of democracy, not the surface window dressing of democracy. But the current situation may be a blip. When I mentioned before about the ISO, for example, these are long-term systemic trends. This is going across the whole world solidly, and no single person's in charge, really. Now, Putin is a single person in charge, which means he's more vulnerable than, say, is ISO or IEEE. Right? So I'm saying, think about the big sweeps of history. First organization was religion. Then the next thing built on top of that, which was nation state. You remember there's this famous painting of Napoleon when he's going to crown himself. He takes the crown out of the hand of the religious leaders, says, I crown myself, not you guys.
yeah.
Well, that was symbolically, in a sense, artistically, that transition. But religion's still there, but nation state gets built on top of it. Now we're in the process of Google and China having an argument and so forth. So that's corporations create a new kind of power. It's different than nation state power, but new. And eventually we'll have individual power, but that's a bit down the road. But the thing is that as these powers change and move through time, some things are blips, some things are backward sliding, but overall, these massive trends keep on going. The idea of world consciousness is so much different today than it was. I got into futures business around 1970, 71. The stuff I talked about then, as I jokingly said, you're a nice young man, but, take 2 aspirin and get a good night's sleep and get over it. Now it's like, well, are we doing it right? That's a big shift. And that's a more massive shift in my judgment than is particular parties at particular times. And if you take a look at the economic growth of the world, World War I and World War II were blips on the map. They would crash down. We do the State of the Future Index ourselves. It's take a bunch of variables, put it together. It's sort of like a cost of living index, except it's 10 years in the future, and it's global. Now, when we hit that big economic belch back in 2007, 2008, bam, went down, no question, and back up again. Take a look at the COVID thing. On the negative side, we had the parts per million emitted in CO2 and all went down, but bam, now it's back up again. So you got to take a look at what's a blip and what's a long-term systemic. And I would say that the world of strangers being nice to strangers is a massive trend. Completely no, really. You go to an
Well, I
airport.
don't know.
You
I'm
go
not
to an airport.
sure.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
not sure if I mean, certainly the
Do
connectivity of
your data.
people in the world, for sure.
Even terrorism incident and deaths are going down, not up. They were higher about 20 years ago.
Sure,
Really.
but I
What I'm
mean,
trying to say is that the majority of the world is being nice to each other. That's the majority of the world. Now,
Sure,
it is
but is the
understandable.
confrontation between kind of an emerging alternative bloc or
Yes,
system that will
yes,
center around China mainly
right. But then
and
yeah,
the Western system,
yeah.
is that just a blip, or is that
Well,
not something that
uh,
could potentially
China may
derail
China may be more
the
unique.
progress?
Yeah, China may be more of a unique deal. I can come back to that in a second. But Russia, as the old Cold War, is the first time we've had nuclear brinkmanship since Cuba. All right,
I have to add
I
something
agree.
to that, but I will let you
No, no. Okay.
finish your
So
thought.
what I'm
But
saying is that yes, this is a backward slide, no question about it.
Mhm.
And we now also have nuclear capabilities in Pakistan, in Iran, and we have it in India, and we got it in Israel. And maybe we might get something in some other countries. So yes, you can say, well, we're going backward. But sometimes you have backward slides as larger trends underneath them keep going forward. Now, with China, there's different motivations here. I think that Russia, or let's say Putin and his buddies, are interested in increasing power while reducing the power of the United States. Information warfare, I
Mhm.
wrote about that stuff 30 years ago, by the way, pushing down. China is a little different. I think China simply wants to be the acknowledged global power, not by tearing down the United States, but by saying, look, our power is going up and down throughout thousands of years. This is just another cycle we're
Mhm.
going through. You in America, geez, a little blip yourself, compared. So I don't think. I mean, China would like to get our information software. All that's true. And yes, they might want to do some information warfare to say, don't look behind the curtain on this virus, etc. I mean, so forth. So all that I acknowledge, but the motivation of China and Russia are different. I think that we will have something different with China than we've had with Russia because there's different motivations behind them.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not so sure on this. I have to add to this too. At this point,
Mhm.
in my mind, I'm not as much of a, I'm not buying into the mainstream media presentation of the situation that we have right now. For instance, with Russia, because if you, I mean, and I have to, the truth is, large parts of the world are also not buying into the Western mainstream media version of the story. If you look at India, the Middle East, China, South America, that's large parts of the world. They're not buying that story of, the way that the situation is presented, simply because if you look into the reasons which Russia presented for attacking Ukraine, they said these guys are, they're saying these guys are Nazis or whatever, terrorists and so on, and they have biological weapons, they have weapons of mass destruction, and we need to regime change them. If you look at the reasons that they presented, they uncannily are quite similar to the reasons that the United States and the UK and the NATO presented when they attacked and invaded a series of countries in the Middle East before. And people have not forgotten that, So I'm
Yeah,
not supporting the Russian invasion in any way, but I'm also like, I cannot not see that,
sure,
that there was previously a series of wars
sure.
on a
Just,
very similar, under very similar
because right,
argumentation.
just because A
And
is wrong doesn't mean B is not
no,
wrong too.
no,
Of course,
absolutely. It doesn't
of
mean
course.
that nobody's trying to justify,
Yeah.
something that's wrong. But
Mhm.
large parts of the world's population, whether that's
Mhm.
in South America or in the Middle East, if you're following people who following Indian news or following Al Jazeera, they get a different picture of this story. They're not getting that same because they remember that, and they're just simply not buying the way that this is being condemned by certain people in the West as something unprecedented and as something that has not never been done like this, and breach of international law. And so people have a memory. They're just like, okay, but you did the same thing, like, and because that's happening, I think that when China gets actually stronger, China is not yet the world's largest economy, but they will be soon. I mean, in terms of industry, they're already, but in 5 to 10 years, and by the end of the decade, very well, China might be the
Mhm.
largest economy in the world. And when that happens, I think it is possible, and I don't think that's a good thing. I'm not at all for that, but I think it's possible that there would be this kind of new Cold War situation, and a lot of those countries would try to kind of switch sides and switch over basically to the Chinese systems or to the Chinese kind of alternative systems. And in my mind, that's not a good situation at all. I think we should find a way to overcome all of these differences and have some real kind of global planetary understanding and a planetary some form of federation or some form of higher kind of unity. But I think it is a scenario or a possibility that certainly exists.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the idea doing future stuff, is that you want to lay out all of those possibilities, whether you like them or not. Exactly right. You have to lay them out and say, okay, now what do we do? That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, decision makers everywhere, I mean, and people themselves have to participate in that too, right? And to think to how can we influence and direct and towards different outcomes. Right. I mean, you're saying, you talked about the short-term things and then the larger trends. And I do agree with you that there is a macro trend towards more connectivity, less war, more, and let's hopefully that macro trend, will actually, be strong enough to overcome these kind of, oppositions that are being created right now, but they exist. Yep. So, yeah, I mean, with regards to, so maybe with regards to technology, we could talk a little bit about, the changes with, that obviously we have exponential technologies, disruptive technologies coming onto the scene faster than ever before. Right now, I looked into an early publication that you had, which was about the future minds bringing together the idea. The idea was there to bring together what you called technocrats and mystics.
Oh, good for you.
And I think that's
did you get a copy of the actual book?
No, I have to admit, I only read about it, summaries and about it, but I wasn't able to,
because it's an official
short time to prepare for the interview. I wasn't able to actually get the actual book, but I read about it, and the idea there about bringing together those, seemingly opposing strands of like the instrumental way of thinking and the more, open consciousness oriented form. I think that's so important for the future of humanity. And there's now so many technologies, coming to, I mean, consciousness is being studied and understood way more now than it ever was before. There is things such as direct brain links and, BCI and Neuralink and so on and so forth starting to emerge. How do you see, now, maybe decades after this book was written, how do you see that task, which again I think is super vital and important, of merging the technocrat and the mystic, those two ways of approaching the world? How do you see that now, maybe with regards to new technologies and new possibilities that affords?
Well, it is beginning. It is beginning. One sort of fun anecdote is, I remember being somewhere in Silicon Valley, and I said, when this book came out 30 years ago, saying, well, is Steve Jobs a mystic or a technocrat? And there was sort of stuttering in the room. Said, well, you could see that, well, which is he? Because, when he died, at his funeral, they gave out the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, whatever it was, autobiography of Yogi or whatever it was. I forgot the guy's name. Now, how many people do that that are considered to be just a technocrat? The idea of consciousness, we're slowly getting comfortable, not there yet, slowly getting comfortable, say, how do you take this matter and somehow get a mind and a consciousness? How is that? Why is there something there rather than nothing? And why? So we're struggling with that now. If you look at the back of your dollar bill, we have on the back of the dollar, I don't have any, oh boy, I'm too
Yeah.
rich. I got all these big numbers and numbers. Anyway, the back of the dollar bill's got the pyramid with the eye in it on Chomsky.
Right.
What's that about? Americans are embarrassed about consciousness and enlightenment. We can talk about the ego. That's the policy. The pyramid was the goal. The ego was the policy. So we put it on the back of the dollar bill so that everybody would remember. But no one remembers that. So it's slowly the idea of consciousness studies is growing rapidly. The Academy of Science just last week, you can Google it, Academy of Science, United States, psychedelics.
Yeah.
Research and mental development and health. Big studies going on.
Right.
We're slowly getting into the idea consciousness matters. That's a cool thing to talk about. Now we know that technology can make you dumb and that technology can make you smart. Well, why don't we just do the technology to make you smart rather than dumb? Well, that's a conversation about, the social media is just creating a little well and you dig yourself to. Well, we're not talking about it. When I was involved in getting what was called packet switching, that's the thing that makes internet so cheap. It takes a packet and switches to a satellite. So that's why it cuts your cost. So I was putting these in third world countries, dictatorships and so forth. And that's another story for another day. Anyway, got out alive. And at the time, we thought we were this wonderful group of wizards with this magic wand going around the world, connecting up countries and, right underneath the noses of dictators. It was cool. This is really cool. And yes, I was aware of information warfare. There's a problem in there. But I wasn't aware of like coordinating terrorism. I wasn't aware of the wells, digging.
Sorry, when is this? When?
It was 1980s, early 1980s.
And which countries were you going to? Could you mention them or not?
Yeah, sure. I mean, now I'm governments have changed. Probably about a third of Africa,
right?
Probably about half of Latin America, and maybe about 4 or 5 countries in Asia. We did 29 countries, I think, altogether. But the point is, I'm bringing up, is there was very little technology assessment of the internet. First of all, most people thought it was for the elites. I mean, I can't tell you how many people say you're a nice young man, but this has got nothing to do with third world development. Anyway, but now, as you pointed out, IEEE is looking at standards on AI. The whole world. I mean, I'm trying to keep track of this stuff. And every day there's important research done, new articles, new conferences. It is a gigantic global conversation on how do you do AI, good, bad, irrelevant, standards. It's a massive conversation around the planet. We had nothing like that when the internet started. Nothing. And when people got together, they said, "Oh, this is cool, man. Guess what I did in the Dominican Republic?" I mean, that was the conversation, man. So I bring that up to say that we are not blindly walking into technology. That was my comment against Alvin Toffler. Alvin Toffler's Future Shock had a 50th anniversary. I was one of the people write up on a book, and I said, well, he got it right about continuous change, but he got it wrong about shock. We got habituated. Here's the next version. Okay. Here's the next version. Okay. We got habituated. Of course. Well, where's the thinking? Where's your agency of your mind involved? Well, it's beginning. I would say that is a light and dark difference between the beginning of internet and the beginning of AI. So that's an example I would point to of the beginning of, and it doesn't matter whether you're China or United States. And this is jumping over back to the conversation about China and how I think that the dynamics may be a little different this time. We did with the Soviet Union figure out how to manage nuclear weapons. They were classified, they were secret, they were weapons, they were all the things that everybody says, but we figured out how to make a management system. Everybody went up the same level and slowly you're going down. All right, we're not out of the woods yet, as you point out. We're right back into geopolitical brinkmanship. Maybe not as big as Cuba, but the dynamics are essentially the same in my judgment. That's a problem. But with China and the AI, as we go from narrow intelligence to general intelligence, the initial conditions of general will determine how it grows into super. because we won't know how it grows in a super, because that's beyond our. The only thing we can control is the beginning of artificial general. Now, the hotshots in China understand this. The hotshots in the United States understand this. The hotshots in Japan understand, etc. So now is the beginning of a conversation. We're not making much progress yet, but at least it's out there in your podcast of how do you pull together the thinking to what do we mean by the right initial conditions. We know with a seed, you got to have some soil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What are the right conditions to make it grow? And then as it grows up, how do we make sure it doesn't turn this way or turn that way? Well, we have in the International Atomic Energy Agency a bunch of standards and rules. This is how you manage nuclear stuff. That's the rules. It takes a while to get to those rules. Artificial general intelligence is going to be way more complex than the than atomic energy. And by the way, way more complex than even climate change. And as far as the risk, the existential risk, the AI going the wrong way is a more immediate risk to us than, because climate change, you don't get the sulfur dioxide stuff that finishes you off until about 2125 or so.
Yeah.
Hopefully we don't get there. But that's the old prediction. We predict if we continue to be stupid, that's where we get. But that doesn't finish us off for about over 100 years. Whereas AI turning into general could happen, maybe not, but could happen as early as 10 years. If it does and we're not prepared for it, then it's out of our control.
Absolutely.
Just hope it turns out okay.
So I had a conversation last week with Roman Yampolsky, and I'm going to link that conversation too, who is one of the leading scientists in the world, maybe the leading scientist with regards to the control problem for artificial general intelligence. And the conclusion of that conversation was that we currently have no idea whatsoever of how to control artificial general intelligence, apart from potentially us becoming that artificial intelligence by merging with it, connecting our brains.
And that brings us back to Future Mind, because that was my position. Yeah, that was my position 30 years ago. If you can't beat them, join them.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I'm fine with that idea. I think that if why not? I mean, humans have been around for a certain time, which in the cosmic picture or the Earth age picture is not even that much. And it's not, why not evolve further? Why not merge with technology and take things to the next level that way? Do you think that the singularity is a distinct possibility, and in that case, would it be kind of the final scenario somehow that could be predicted?
How you go throughout history, how many final scenarios have there been written, so to speak? So here's another one coming up. I'm happy about Ray's activity, because to me it's like you're making a bouillabaisse. You want to have a little of this seasoning, a little bit of that seasoning. This goes back to this multifaceted stuff, the opera stuff. I don't want everybody to think the whole future is singularity, because that is a technocrat nightmare in my judgment. Because but then if you have just the consciousness stuff, you're not going to be able to run a world of 9 billion people. It'll fall apart. So that's why you got to have both. So Ray is a little, and singularity folks not all of them, but many of them are pretty shy to talk about enlightenment, consciousness.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. They're quite on the side on the technocrat side.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. But what he has done is he has speeded up a lot of people's thinking. And that's a good idea, because things are speeding up, so we got to speed up too. So I'm glad he's like salt, you don't want to eat just salt, but you want salt in for the flavor.
Yeah, no, I mean, this absolutely the idea that, I'm completely supporting as well. And I think there are nowadays voices and people who are starting to combine those discourses, the technologically informed, transformation of our world. But on the other hand, also that kind of openness to spiritual experiences and to transformative psychology and to transpersonal psychology, experiencing yourself as connected to others, to the world.
Right.
I think that's a very fruitful
Right.
conversation and a very fruitful thing that's happening. To sync up the planet is actually the idea behind Ultrasync. But so where do you? So if I can just quickly still on since we're talking about AI, with regards to narrow AI, though, do you see that tool really being something that changes the practice of future prediction, scenario
Yeah.
prediction, very notably, so
Yeah.
that people could basically it could do the predictions or the scenarios for us?
Well, I'm a great fan of Augment. There's a guy, uh, Doug Inkelbart,
Mhm.
who is credited with inventing the mouse and hyperlinking, and he's one of the Silicon Valley patron saints, so to speak. And he kept using the word augment, and I think that that's a good idea.
Mhm.
Like, you are being augmented. You and I are talking, but that's not quite true, is it? What we're doing is I'm talking to a screen, and you're augmented with these ears things on your head. You got
Yeah.
the thing in front of you with a microphone. You're even leaning on a table, for God's sake. I mean, you are technologically augmented all over the joint. So am I.
Yeah.
And we're going through all these machines, but we think we're talking to each other,
Mm.
right? So, but we get over that idea that there's a consciousness space that we're just talking, and we're technologically augmented.
Mhm.
So yes, futurists will, if they're wise, will pull on as much artificial intelligence as they can get their hands on.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
if it can go through tons of data, then and help out, then why not? Now, it's fair enough to say that AI alone
Mhm.
can come up with some pretty scary conclusions.
Mhm.
There's a movie, I just saw this a while ago. I don't know, maybe you know it. I forgot what it was, but some AI robots went to another planet,
Mhm.
and they're getting everything all set up. And so some humans then come, and then Earth doesn't hear anything for a while, or whatever place there was.
Mhm.
And so another party goes out to sea, and they can't find any humans. And they see all these robots, and they notice that when they frown, the robot becomes aggressive. And when they smile, the robot goes away, because the robot was taught you've got to make people happy. How do you make people? How do you know they're happy? Well, they smile. How do you
Okay.
know they're sad? Well, they frown. Well, if they're frowning, that means I'm failing. Well, if I'm failing, they can turn me off. Well, then
Right.
kill them. Now, that's an exaggeration, obviously, but
Yeah.
it's to the point that you still want to have the consciousness in the technology. I
Right.
remember having a conversation with one of the Kala Rinpoches of Tibet when I was writing that book,
Mhm.
Future Mind. And basically, what he was saying was, any technology you want, fine with me. Just do it with the Buddha consciousness.
Mm.
Then it's okay. So
Mm.
then the idea is, how do you create technology that improves consciousness? And with an improved consciousness, then you make a better technology. So you have
Mhm.
a nice yin yang going on there that makes civilization
Mhm.
work.
Beautiful. Yeah, those are some wonderful thoughts, I think, to round off our conversation. But before we kind of reach a nice conclusion for this great conversation today, I would like to ask you, something that I ask my guests. If you had an opportunity to send a message to all of humanity, somehow a message that would reach the collective consciousness, or that would somehow embed itself, resonate with all of humanity. And there's no pressure, no pressure right now. But if you
No,
had one on, right on the spot,
sure.
basically, what would that be?
It would be to move in the direction of a self-actualizing economy. Now, whether people accept Maslow or not, he's a useful metaphor for progress. Uh, in 1980, half the world, which had over 2 billion fewer people, were in extreme poverty. Today, with those couple billion growing up, it's is not only it's less than half, it's less than 10%. So your basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, is not, there's still 800 more million people that are in a horrible situation, not to mention some people in other countries in conflict. So we're not out of the woods. But the thing is, we are getting the basic needs of civilization as a whole done. Life expectancy now is around 70 some odd, early 70 years, and that includes the Congo as well as Bolivia as well as New York City. And that's a heck of a measure. You going back a little while ago, most people died when they're in their 30s and 40s or in their 40s. And then at the same time, for better or for worse, we've got these a bunch of rules for safety in planes and all that. So we got a whole safety is a thing that governments are supposed to do, and we got regulations internationally with International Telecommunications Union and all that. They're slowly getting together the safety needs. And then you've got this love and belongingness stuff, well, for better or for worse, being taken care of by a lot of social media. So we're slowly, as a species, moving up the hierarchy towards self-actualization. Now, how would you operationalize self-actualization in the economy? Right now, people have to get a job to make money to pay their lives. Okay. But along comes synthetic biology, 3D printing, AI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not necessarily a clear long-term future for having a job to make a living. So we may have to, at some point, tax these robots, tax these AIs. There's all this new wealth creating up. Well, where's it going? To just an elite 0.01%? That's not a stable future, friends. They know that too up there. So we've got to figure out how to get the investment cycle all the way through the whole system and create some sort of a baseline income so that you're not thrown in the street. Because the old social contract, which we're in not left yet, but we're in a transition. The old social contract, you do a good job in school, you get a good job, and you behave, we'll give you retirement. That's the social contract. But if 10, 20, 30 years, the general AI comes in, that's going to cut across things, hard to predict. Narrow intelligence, you can predict how many trucks are created with AI, how many trucks, that you can predict. You can get planned for that, you can train for that. That's not the real problem, but that's what people talk about. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is general. It cuts across real fast. So you can have a shock in the economy. So we have to prepare ahead for that, do our studies, all the studies about artificial guaranteed income and all that, do that, find out what works, what doesn't, and slowly over 10 to 15 years, figure out how to ease that in. As we do that, by the scenarios that we did things on our website, Work and Technology 2050, with different scenarios. One scenario is on self-actualization economy. The idea is you still may have 1 billion people who have conventional jobs, have a conventional boss, running conventional world and so forth. But a lot of that AI will have created an autonomic nervous system, especially for the urban infrastructure. Just like you have an autonomic nervous system, you don't worry about your heartbeat. You don't worry about your digestion. Well, that's what will happen in cities, the same deal, which means an awful lot of employment's not going to be there. So what are you going to do? You still have, as I said, in the world, maybe 1 billion, but we figure maybe 3 billion might be able to make the transition by 2050 into what we call self-actualization. What does that mean? It means that right now you have hobbies. Okay. Because of the social media, you have fans. Well, then you can monetize this like 1 penny per fan or something. I don't know. So you can slowly build up a little income stream. Then you get better at it and you get more marketing. Slowly but surely, you're going to start making a living being yourself, which is very cool because I can't be as good at you as you are you. I can be me pretty well. I know how to do that. And furthermore, if I'm busy being me, why do I want to stop doing that and give you a hard time? I'm liking doing what I'm doing. You want to do that? That's your stuff. That's your problem. So you can have extremely complex global economy with self-actualize, because the way people self-actualize will be their own way. So that, let's say if I'm going off to the Louvre tomorrow and I'm saying, guess what? Who wants to go with me? 10 people, €5 a person. Okay, that's €50 for lunch. Pretty good. So I go through the Louvre and say, hey, can you turn over to that money? What does that say? Well, let me take a look. I'll tell you, son of a gun, guess who this is? And it's interesting for me because I can even have an AI. This is out of those 10,000 people that said they want to do it. I want the 10 who are the most interesting that I want to talk with anybody. I want to be all by myself in Paris, but now I can be with interesting people going through the Louvre. Very cool. And I get a fabulous lunch for €50. Now, that's not a crazy idea. But it just like the early steam engine, it was hard to predict all the details of industrialization, right?
Mhm.
So we'll do the same thing with self-isolate. When you really release the human being, because if you had a baseline, we're not thrown in the street, right? So
Mm.
you don't make much money. It's not, so you'll still want to make a living, and people get bored, looking at the TV after a while. I mean, enough people will. The studies are showing that giving people money does not make them lazy.
Right.
Yes,
So
some,
that's
but not
universal basic income,
right.
which
Yeah,
are
yeah.
yeah.
That's been shown. So I think that some version of that is likely.
Mm.
And that likeliness gives you the freedom to say, I don't have to rush out to get a job. I gotta take whatever I can get as fast as possible. No, you're okay. You'll still get fed. You're not going to get rich. You're not going to be in a fancy place, but you can think, what do I want to do? I don't have to rush into something. I can sort of create it. I can experiment. I mean, Benjamin Franklin, they got this
Mm.
big documentary on Ben Franklin going on right now. In his early days, he made a bunch of businesses, got his money, and then he bought his freedom. And then what did he do? He invents electricity stuff. He invents the rod on top of buildings to protect them. He gets the Franklin stove. I mean, gets all this fabulous stuff. It's just, he's a self-actualizing guy. No one said, go out there and do X. He said, well, that ought to be done. And just started doing it. But he had that basic freedom where he did have the money behind him. Well, there wasn't
Mm.
enough money in the system to have guaranteed income then. But now we're moving in that direction. So I would
Mm.
say the message I would leave with people is understand thyself, old Socratic advice.
Mm.
And what turns you on? Every wealthy person that gets interviewed, they say, you get asked, what was your secret? Follow your passion. Well, okay. Start to do it now. You still have jobs. You still have to, take your time. There's no rush, but start to follow your passion. And how do I connect to markets rather than revolve around a market? Have the
Mm.
world market revolve around me, reverse it.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's a beautiful message. A couple of takeaways, to work towards the self-actualizing economy, to infuse technology with consciousness. I think those are takeaways that we can all get behind. Although obviously those, realizing those things themselves would again turn, into lots of new challenges and lots of new problems. But maybe that could be material for future conversations. So
Right.
I thank you very much, Jerome Glenn, for your great contributions to the field of futurology, and also the work that you've done and the way that you've shared your message and your insights, and also for your inspiring hour and a bit on our podcast here. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you.
And everybody, you're going to get the links for if you want to find out more in the descriptions, if you want to find out more about the Millennium Project, if you want to find out more about the work that Jerome has done. And you can also look forward to many more conversations like this with leading philosophers, entrepreneurs, scientists, you name it, across the board, people who have something to say about the future of humanity. So sync yourself up. Let's go.